Welcome to this Excel VBA tutorial. In this video we're going to cover implicit and explicit weights in Selenium Basic. We'll start with a description of why it's important to wait for elements to exist before you attempt to interact with them, and then we'll describe the implicit weight system and how you can adjust that to your own needs. We'll explain how you can set a timeout for an individual statement which tries to find an element on a page, and then show how you can set a basic explicit weight for a set period of time. Towards the end of the video we'll look at some of the more interesting ways you can wait for elements, including an example of waiting for an element to be displayed on screen. So a couple of interesting things to do here. Let's get started. To get started, I've created a new Excel workbook and I've saved it as a macro-enabled file. Just a quick reminder that if you want to follow along with the video, you'll need to make sure that you have Selenium Basic installed. And if you haven't already done that, we have a video which explains how to get it set up. The first example we'll cover in the video is going to be based on the Wikipedia main page, and specifically what happens when you type something into the search box. You probably already know this, but if you type something in, you get a list of suggestions, and I'm interested in getting that list written out so that I can follow some of those links. So while I'm here, I've got the URL for the main page for Wikipedia. I'm just going to copy that to the clipboard. Now I'm going to head back to Excel and open up the Visual Basic editor, and let's write out the basic code to navigate to that main page. So I'm going to head up to the Tools menu in the VB editor and choose References, and I'll want to make sure I can set a reference to the Selenium type library, so I can click into the list and type in the letter S to jump down in the list to find Selenium type library. And when I've checked the box, click OK. I can then insert a new module into the project. And then at the top of this module, I'm going to declare a module level variable, which will hold a reference to my Chrome driver. So I'm going to be using Google Chrome for this example. So I'll say private CD as selenium.chrome driver. I'll get there eventually. The subroutine we're going to write, it doesn't really matter what it's called. I'm going to call mine wait for elements. And then the first thing I'll do in here is set a reference to a new instance of the Chrome driver. So I can say set cd equals new selenium.chrome driver. And then I can start that browser and I can say to get the URL for the Wikipedia main page. So in a set of double quotes, I can just paste in what I've copied from my open instance of Chrome. And then I can give that one a quick test to make sure that part's running. And when the page finally appears, there we go. Okay, so we're good to go, ready to start interacting with that search box. In order to interact with the elements on the page, we need to have some way to identify them. And a nice way to find out how to identify an element is to inspect it in the web browser. So I'm going to head back over to my open instance of Chrome, and the first thing I care about is the search box itself. So I'm going to right click on the search box and choose Inspect. In Chrome, that opens up a panel on the right hand side of the screen which shows you the element you've just inspected and provides several possible options for identifying it. I'm going to use CSS selectors for this particular video. If you've watched the previous video in the series, you'll be aware that there are several ways to identify a particular element. So what I'm going to do here for the sake of convenience is to right click on that element and choose Copy and then Copy Selector. That will automatically pick the best way to identify that specific element, and because this element has a unique ID called search input, that's what will be copied to the clipboard. So at this point I'm just going to head back to the VB editor. I'm going to add a quick comment that says interact with search input, and then on the next line add another comment and then paste in what I've just copied. I'm not actually going to perform the interaction just yet. I want to focus on the list of suggestions first before we interact with the search input. So I'm going to head back to Wikipedia again, and then I'm going to make my suggestions list appear. I'm going to type in something into the search box, and then I can right click on any of these suggestions and again choose to inspect it. So that jumps down in the list now to the list of suggestions that have appeared, and it's highlighted the one that I right clicked on. I'm more interested not in a single individual suggestion, but the container which holds all of them. So if I just scroll back up a tiny little bit, I'll find this element, a div element, with a class called suggestions. There's no unique ID for this particular element, but again, I can still right click on the element and choose copy, and then choose copy selector. I'm then going to head back to my VB editor, and I'm going to add a quick comment, get list of suggestions. And then on the next line, I'm just going to paste in what I've copied from Google Chrome to see what we get. So there's an example of a CSS selector. It's looking in the body element of the page, and then for a direct child of the body element, which is a div element whose class is suggestions. Now this is a little more elaborate than it needs to be to get what I want. I can get away in this particular case. I'm pretty confident that there is only one suggestions element on the page, so I don't actually need all this qualifying code here. I can just look for something with a class of suggestions. I am going to add a variable which will allow me to capture a reference to that object. Then I'm going to say dim suggestions, if I can spell that correctly, suggestions. I'll try again. I'll get there eventually, I promise. There we go. Suggestions div as selenium.webElement, so a single element. And then I'm going to say set suggestions div equals cd dot, and I'm going to use the FindElement by CSS method. So inside the round brackets and the double quotes, all I need to do is pass in the name of the class I'm interested in, preceded with a full stop, of course. That's important to identify a class. I can then close the double quotes and close the round brackets, just get rid of that comment that I put in. And there we go, we've identified the elements we're interested in. At this point, I'd just like to run the subroutine to see what happens. So I'll hit the execute or run button. I'll see a new instance of Chrome opens up. I can see my swirly blue mouse cursor staying there for a few seconds, and then eventually it ends. But if I switch back to the VB editor at this point, I get a runtime error telling me that it couldn't find an element with the class suggestions, which is funny because I'm pretty sure I just identified that from my other open instance of Chrome. So what's going on here? If I just zoom back out again, and then I'm going to click debug just to show that it is that line which has caused the problem, of course. I guess that's fairly obvious. And I'm going to have a look at my instance of Chrome that's been opened up by this code. And if I just right click anywhere on the background of the page, I want to not right click on the input box this time. So I'm going to right click somewhere on the background of the page and choose inspect. I'll just maximize that window there as well. What I'd like to do now inside this elements panel on the right hand side is try to find something called suggestions. So I'm going to press Ctrl and F to open up the find box, and I'm going to try to type in suggestions. And you can see that it hasn't suggested any elements have the word suggestions as part of it. And the reason for that is that the suggestions list doesn't get generated when you first launch the Wikipedia page. The suggestions list only gets created when you interact with this search box. So if I click into the search box, I don't know if you can see now already in the background, it's generated the class called suggestions. So if I click back in the search box here, or the find box, and press enter, now it's found multiple elements with suggestions, and I can scroll through them to see that it's definitely found them. So what does that tell us? Well, let me just close down this instance of Chrome and I'll stop running this procedure. So that tells us that there is a potential that we might not find a particular element when we first try to look for it. I want to look at how you can control how long it takes for Selenium to search for something before it fails. I'd just like to add a bit of extra code that will tell us whether or not the suggestions element is present. And I'm going to do that first of all, just after we've loaded the main page of Wikipedia. So I'm going to declare a new variable called findBy, and it's going to hold a reference to a new instance of the selenium.by class. I can then use that to print some information into the immediate window. So I'm going to say debug.print, and then I can use the isElementPresent method of the Chrome driver, so cd.isElementPresent. I can then open up some round brackets, and then I need to pass in a reference to a by object. So I'm going to say findBy, and then I'm going to use the CSS technique again. And then in some round brackets and some double quotes, I'm just going to copy and paste the .suggestions class. And in fact, I might as well copy everything to the end of that line, and then close the extra set of round brackets. So that method returns true or false, depending on whether that element has been found or not. But there's no delay on this one, so you notice when we did the FindElement by CSS there was a delay. This one detects at any given point whether that element exists. It's probably worthwhile just adding a bit of extra text to the beginning of that, so I can say suggestions present and then concatenate that with the result of the function. Let's just display the immediate window as well so that we can see the results of this when we do run the subroutine. And if I do run it one more time, we'll see that we get the same pause again. So waiting, and then when it's finished, we'll end up with the same runtime error, but it has told me before it tried to find that element or get a reference to that element that the suggestions present is false, just as we'd expect. The delay that we're experiencing when we can't find the element we're looking for is due to the built-in or implicit wait of the WebDriver we're using. By default, all of the FindElement methods in Selenium Basic have a built-in delay of 3 seconds to give the element we're looking for a chance to be created. And this is a good idea in websites whose content is generated dynamically. We've already established that the suggestions div doesn't exist until we interact with the search input box. So if you imagine if we had filled in this bit of code here to search for something, there could be a delay between typing in what we're looking for and the list of suggestions being created. If our code ran without delay, it's possible that we could try to capture a reference to the object before it's had a chance to be created, which would lead to a runtime error. So that 3-second delay is designed to give the element a chance to be created. You can write code to modify the duration of the implicit wait in case you wanted to make it longer or shorter. To do that, I can head back up to the top of the subroutine just after I've created the new instance of the driver, and then I can say cd.timeouts.implicitWait. So this property can be set to be the value of the delay in milliseconds that you want. The default is 3 seconds. If I wanted to make it much shorter, I could type in 100, so 1/10 of a second. And then if I were to run the subroutine again, we'll see the same thing happens, but after the web page is loaded, I don't get the long 3-second delay. You can see it's finished virtually instantly. I'll still end up with the same end result here because we know at this point the suggestions div isn't being created, but the code takes a lot less time to run. You can also change the timeout for each individual FindElement method. If I click back into the round brackets where we're trying to find the suggestions div, if I type in a comma after the CSS selector parameter, I can see that I've got an optional timeout parameter. Its default value is -1, which means it will just use the default or the implicit wait time. But if I wanted to say, for example, the suggestions div is one that may take a long time to be generated, I could bump this up to say 3000 milliseconds, which sets it back to the default. And then if I were to run the subroutine again, I'll see that this time when the page is loaded, I do get back to that 3-second delay before the circular mouse cursor disappears again. So you can either set a default implicit wait by changing the timeout's implicit wait property, or you can do this on an individual basis each time you attempt to find an element. Let's move on and add some code to actually interact with our search input box. I'm going to add a bit of code where I've left my comment earlier on. I'm going to declare a new variable called search input, and that will be a selenium.webElement. I'm then going to set the search input to be equal to cd.FindElement by CSS, and then in some round brackets and some double quotes, I'm just going to copy and paste the ID that I copied earlier on. And in fact, I can just then get rid of that comment. So what I want to do once I've captured a reference to it is I'd like to click on it. So I'm going to say search input.click. I'm just going to tidy up and get rid of the implicit wait and the explicit timeout that I added on earlier on. So I'm going to remove the code which modifies the timeout implicit wait property. And I'm also going to get rid of the parameters value for the timeout in the FindElement by CSS method. So that's now everything working back on the default value of 3 seconds. I'd then just like to quickly copy and paste the line which tells us whether the suggestions element is present. So we've done this at the very beginning of the procedure before we've done anything on the page, just after it's been loaded. So that will always return false because we haven't done anything on the page yet. I'm going to copy that line and I'm going to paste it in just after I've clicked on the search input box. And then I'm going to paste it in one more time after I've captured a reference to the suggestions div. Having done that, I'm going to clear the contents of the immediate window. And when we run this, we should end up with 3 messages telling us whether the suggestions element is present at 3 different points. Once we load the web page, after we click the search input, and then after we capture the reference to the suggestions div. So if I run the subroutine at this point, we'll see the page loads. I don't get the 3-second delay this time, so that's a good sign. If I click back into the background of the VB editor, I don't have any runtime errors. It's reached the end. And you can see this is the importance of having that built-in wait for elements to exist. Clicking the search input does generate the suggestions div. But when we try to print out whether it exists or not immediately after the click, the page hasn't had time yet to generate that div element. We have then the code which finds the element with its built-in 3-second implicit wait. It doesn't wait the full 3 seconds, of course. Once it can retrieve the element, it will then proceed with the rest of the code. So you can see finally on the last line there that the suggestions element is indeed present. Let's move on and try to list out the suggestions that Wikipedia comes up with based on what we type in. So the idea here is that if I go back to my open instance of Chrome, each of the suggestions generates an anchor or A element, and I want to write out the text of that element and the href to get the actual URL that it's pointing to. So all of those A elements exist within the suggestions div. Let's tidy up the code a little bit first. I'm going to get rid of these debug.print statements just to clean things up a bit. So I've got 3 of those to remove, and I'll get rid of the one at the top there as well. I would also then like to modify what I'm doing with the search input. Rather than just clicking on it, I'd like to search for something. So I'm going to change the click method to the send keys method instead. And what should we search for? Let's search for VBA. Why not? It seems appropriate. What we can then do is declare a couple of new variables. So after we've captured the reference to the suggestions div, I'm going to say dim suggestions. I don't know why I'm trying to return that from the IntelliSense list. It's a brand new variable. So dim suggestions as selenium.webelements. So that's going to be a collection. And then another variable to hold a single suggestion. So dim suggestion as selenium.webelement. To capture the entire collection of suggestions, I'm going to look in the suggestions div element for any elements with an A tag. So I can say set suggestions equals suggestions div dot find elements by CSS. And if I want to find any elements with a particular tag, I can just write that tag name in a set of double quotes. So in this case, it'll be the A tag. What I can then do is loop through the collection of suggestions. I can say for each suggestion in suggestions, and then next suggestion. And then inside this loop, I can say debug.print suggestion dot, and I can type in, I can refer to the text method to return the text of that A element, and then a comma, and I can say suggestion dot attribute, and then in some round brackets and double quotes, I can return the href attribute of that object as well. Okay, now this is where things get a little tricky to test. If I run this subroutine, I genuinely don't know whether or not I'll get a list of suggestions printed out. So let's find out. I'm just going to run it and see what happens when we search for VBA. So we can see that we load the web page and VBA gets written out into the box. And then if I look back at the VB editor, I can see that, oh, it didn't actually write out those suggestions. It didn't fail to find something. You can see that I didn't get any runtime error, there was no delay. The code just ran really quickly and didn't have a chance to capture the list of VBA suggestions. The trouble is that that's not always necessarily the case. We've got a bit of a race going on between Wikipedia loading that list of suggestions and our code running to print out the list. Again, it's my code's run too quickly this time for Wikipedia to catch up, so again I didn't get the list of suggestions. But we can keep on trying this, and sometimes you'll see, as I say, this is tricky to test, but sometimes you'll see, oh, in this case it has worked. So I got 2 failures and 1 success just by running the exact same code 3 times without making any changes. So what can we do about this? First of all, it's worthwhile explaining why we didn't see either a runtime error or a delay when we were trying to find the A elements but they hadn't been generated yet. The reason is we're using the FindElements method rather than a FindElement method. When the FindElements methods run, they can return an empty collection. So if there are no A elements, it will still return something without failing. It'll just be an empty collection. So we're essentially here looping through a collection of no items. We can demonstrate that fairly clearly actually. We could do a debug.print of how many elements the collection contains. So we could say debug.print suggestions.count. And then if I clear the contents of the immediate window, I think what I'll do is make sure that we're looking for something which we know won't return anything at all. So let's change the suggestions to look for something with any old class name. So I'm pretty confident that Wikipedia doesn't have any elements that have that particular class. So we should return a collection of 0 elements, but without a delay and without a runtime error. So we can run that. And we'll get the page loaded up and we'll get some suggestions, but nothing gets printed out, but we get 0 elements listed out. It tells us that that collection didn't contain anything. Okay, so how can we solve this problem? I'm just going to clear the contents of the immediate window and get rid of my debug.print statement as well. And I'll revert this FindElements back to looking for A elements. One thing we could do is set an explicit wait. After we've captured the suggestions div, we could tell the code to pause before it continues. Now there's a bit of guesswork involved here. How long do you tell it to pause for? Well, let's just show you the practical application of this. Let's say cd.wait, and then you can specify a time in milliseconds. I'll go for, let's say, half a second. Let's say 500 milliseconds. So if I run this one at this time, we'll see. We search for VBA and it prints out the list, and you saw there was a short delay there before it actually printed out that list. You can see this even more clearly with a much longer delay. If I stick in, let's go for 2 seconds, let's go for 2000. I'll just clear the contents of the immediate window again, and then we can run the subroutine one more time, and you'll see there's that clear delay there of a couple of seconds before anything happens in the immediate window. So the problem with this is that there's a bit of guesswork involved, and of course, no matter what conditions are true, that delay will always happen, which is a little bit irritating when you know it could potentially work a bit faster. Fortunately, Selenium provides a range of ways to test a variety of states of an element. A good one to check for this particular example would be whether our list of suggestions has appeared on screen yet. So there's a potential delay between typing something in and that list of suggestions being displayed, so we can check that using a property of the element. Let's head back to the Visual Basic Editor, and I'm just going to get rid of the cd.wait line, and I'm going to replace it with a debug.print statement first of all. So let's say debug.print, and then I can say suggestions displayed, and then I can concatenate that with a reference to the suggestions div. And then I can check the isDisplayed property, a simple Boolean property which tells you whether or not the item is displayed on screen. There are a couple of other useful ones worthwhile mentioning. There's an isEnabled property, so whether you can interact with the element. There's an isPresent property. You may have captured a reference to an element when it existed at some point, but then the web page may have changed so that that element has been removed. So you can check whether the element still exists or not. And you can also check if it's selected. So suggestionsdiv.isDisplayed. I'd then actually like to wait until the suggestions div definitely is displayed on screen. And tied in with the isDisplayed property, there's an option to wait for the element to be displayed. To do that, I can simply say suggestionsdiv.waitDisplayed. And you can see again, there are several other options there for waiting until a specific condition has been met. So for this example, I'm going to say suggestionsdiv.waitDisplayed. And then I'd just like to print out the status of its isDisplayed property again. So I'm just going to copy and paste that line. Okay. So when we wait for it to be displayed, we can pretty much guarantee that this one will always return true. But the first printing of the isDisplayed property might not return true because it might not have had time to be displayed on screen yet. Let's see what happens if we search for VBA again. Again, it's difficult to predict exactly what will happen when we're testing these sorts of procedures. So let's close down that and see what we got. So we got 2 trues. So our div was displayed in time. This time I got the true result from the isDisplayed property. Let's maybe change the suggestion that we're searching for. So let's say Selenium this time. I'll clear the contents of the immediate window and then run the subroutine again. Let's see what happens this time. Good. So we'll always get our list of results. We're waiting for that list to be displayed, and it came out with true and true again. Shall we give it one more try? Tell you what, let's search for something completely different. Let's search for where Wise Owl is based, the little town of Glossop. There you go, learning something about Wise Owl. So I'll run that one more time. So of course we'll get the list printed out because we're waiting for that list to be displayed. There we go, good. So in this case, we ran this instruction before the div was displayed, but then this one, of course, waited for it to be displayed before it printed out the results. So there we go. For the next part of the video, I thought it would be good to show a slightly more practical example of some of the wait techniques we've seen here. This example actually comes from a question asked by someone who was watching one of the much earlier videos I created on web scraping using Internet Explorer. And what he wanted to do is capture the flight information at Cairo Airport. So on loading this page, you land on the arrivals for today. And what he wanted to do is scrape that table into an Excel worksheet and then click on the link for tomorrow's flights and get those, and then head to the departures section and grab the table for today's departures, and then likewise get the departures for tomorrow. And you can see as we're clicking between these different versions of the different tables that we're getting a short delay in loading that information. So we need to make sure that we're waiting for the appropriate time to capture the information in the table. So while I'm here, I'm going to copy the URL from the address bar and then head back to the Visual Basic Editor. And I'm going to create a new subroutine. I'll add this up at the top of the existing module. And I'll call this something like Cairo Flights. And then I'll just quickly paste this in as a comment first of all. And then I'm just going to copy and paste the first few parts from my original subroutine. So creating a new instance of the Chrome driver, starting it and getting a URL. So I'll copy that and then just paste that in at the beginning of that new procedure so that we're basically navigating to the flight information for Cairo Airport. Now let's look at how to identify the elements we want to copy. If we switch back to Chrome, and then I'm going to right click on the top left hand corner cell of the table and choose to inspect it. You can see it opens up a fairly deeply nested set of elements, and the one I'm interested in is the table element. So you can see that if I hover the mouse cursor over that, it highlights the entire table. It's got a class, a compound class in fact. It's got table, table-striped and FL-table. As it turns out, there's more than one table on this page which has that collection of classes assigned to it. In fact, if I double click just to highlight that and then copy that text, Then I can press Control and F to find, and I find that's pasted into the search box. And I can see that I've got two different elements on the page which have that collection of classes. So the one that I'm looking at the moment, let me just collapse the header row of that. You can see that corresponds to the table body with the unique ID of ARR, short for arrivals, I'm assuming. If I head down to the next version of that, I can see another table. I can't see it highlighted on the page because it's not actually visible at the moment. But if I expand that, I can see that it's got its own body with its own unique ID called departures. So you'll see that if I switch to the departures page, I can now highlight that table because it's visible on the screen. If I switch back to arrivals, that table is no longer visible, so I can't access it. So that's useful information. Let's head back up to, in fact, let's just use the search box. Let's head back up to the original table, the arrivals table. If I expand the body of that, we can see all the individual rows in there, and I can see those being highlighted. If I switch between today and tomorrow, you can see that the structure of the table doesn't change. It's still the arrivals table that's being displayed on screen. It's just changed the information inside that table. So it's updated the actual data using some JavaScript. Yeah, I'm not quite sure how that works, but anyway, we can see that the contents of the table change. That's the important part. So with that table class available, it's probably a good idea to get a reference to all the tables with that collection of classes assigned to it. So I'm going to right click on that table element and choose copy and then copy selector. I can then head back to the Visual Basic editor and let's declare a variable. Let's call it flight tables as selenium.web_elements, as we know there's going to be more than one of them. And then we can set flight tables to be equal to cd.FindElements by CSS, and then in some round brackets and double quotes, I'm just going to paste in the selector that I've copied. That's not actually the selector I wanted. I actually wanted the names of the classes. So I'm going to head back to the flight information page, and I'm just going to double click to highlight the three classes in that table attribute. Copy those to the clipboard, head back to VBA, and then paste those in. To reference compound classes with CSS selectors, you just put them all together, separated by single full stop characters. Again, we covered that in the previous video in the series where we talked about CSS selectors. So at that point, it's probably worthwhile quickly checking that we've captured some tables. So we can say debug.print flight tables.count. And then if we run the subroutine, we should find that when the page loads, the tables appear. And if we look back at the background of our VB editor, we have captured references to two tables in that collection. Okay, so writing out the contents of one of those tables to an Excel worksheet is pretty straightforward. We've got a reference to a table element, and there's a method built into Selenium Basic that lets you convert that into a table and then write it directly out into an Excel sheet. To do that, let's refer to the first table in our collection. So I'm going to say flight tables, open some round brackets, and then refer to the first element in there. I can then apply the asTable method to that single table, and then I can say to Excel. And at that point, all I have to do is specify where I want that table to go. I'd like it to go into cell A2 of a brand new worksheet in this workbook. So I'm going to say this workbook dot worksheets dot add and then say dot range A2. And the reason I'm using range A2 is so that I can then say range A1. So when you insert a new worksheet, it becomes active. So I can say range A1 and refer to cell A1 of that sheet and say dot value equals arrivals today. Okay. So at that point, I'll just comment out, or in fact delete the debug.print statement for the time being, and then run the subroutine again. I will load the page, load the tables, and when I get back to Excel, I'll see that I've written out all the arrival information from today. So just a quick sense check there, just a quick visual check that we're looking at the correct information, that all looks pretty good to me. Okay, next I'd like to get the arrivals information for tomorrow. So I'll just close down this instance of Chrome, and I'll also delete that worksheet so that we don't end up with loads and loads of extra worksheets. And then switch back to my open instance of Chrome. And I want to find out what the name of that button is, or that link element. I'm going to right click on it and choose to inspect it. And I can see that the individual element is an A tag, an anchor tag, like those that we saw for the Wikipedia example. It doesn't have a unique ID, but what I can see is that A element is nested inside a list element. So you can see an LI element there, and that does have a unique ID, TO. And there's another one for, I guess, today's, which is TT, and yesterday's, which is YY. So I'm going to rely on using the list element. I can find this element by its unique ID and then click on that to load the next table. So I can, although it's not too much effort to type in TO, I can right click on that element and choose copy and then copy selector. And then I'm going to head back to the Visual Basic Editor. And then after I have pasted in today's arrivals, I'm going to say cd.FindElement by CSS, and then open some round brackets and double quotes. Paste in the unique identifier that I've just copied, and then close the double quotes and close the round brackets, and then say .click. So that will click on the tomorrow button and load the new table. What I'd like to do then is just retrieve the content of flight table 1 again. So the first table is the arrivals, the second table is the departures. So I'm looking at the arrivals for tomorrow. So the simplest thing to do here is just copy and paste those 2 lines of code and then update the range A1.value to say arrivals tomorrow instead. So let's give this one a quick test. If we click somewhere inside the subroutine and choose to run it, we'll see it loads up the page. And we know that it already captures the first table. So today, and we can see that it has indeed clicked on the tomorrow button, and it will have generated a new worksheet with tomorrow's information. So let's compare the results. Let's head back to Excel. So currently I'm looking at the arrivals for tomorrow. But if I look at that, I mean, it's fairly obvious at this point already that apparently some arrivals for tomorrow have already arrived, quite a lot of them in fact. And if you compare this page here with what's displayed on the actual web page, we're not getting the same results. If you look at sheet 3, which is the arrivals for today, and sheet 4, the arrivals for tomorrow, you can see that we've failed to capture the new information. Our code ran too quickly. The code won the race between the website updating and getting the new information. So this is the point, of course, at which we need to think about how we can pause or wait until the new table has updated. Let's just clear up the worksheets. I'm going to highlight and then delete both of those new worksheets. I'll close down that extra instance of Chrome as well and head back to the Visual Basic Editor. And I guess a nice simple way to do this is just with a basic explicit wait. I don't think it takes too long for that table to be updated. I think a delay of maybe a second or perhaps half a second would be sufficient to make this work. So let's say cd.wait, and then I'm going to pass in a wait time of 1000 milliseconds, 1 second. So if we run this one again now, we will see Chrome is interacted with in the same way. So we'll end up with, start with today and then click the tomorrow button. I think we could have gotten away with a lot less time than just 1 second. Let's have another comparison now. If we look back at the results, we can see sheet 6, that looks more promising already. So nothing has arrived yet for tomorrow, which is a good sign. And if we compare that with what's displayed on the actual web page, that looks like we've got what we want. Just to quickly reassure ourselves, I suppose, that sheet 5, the arrivals for today, is still returning the correct information. That all looks pretty good to me. Now let's look at capturing the departure information. I've already tidied up my workbook by deleting those extra worksheets, and I've closed down the other instance of Chrome. we saw when we printed out the number of tables we had captured that we got 2 tables. So even before we display the departures table, we do actually have access to it in our flight tables collection. Let's see what happens if we attempted to just print that information out. So if I just copy the line which prints out today's arrivals and then paste that in down towards the bottom, I could attempt to change the flight tables to 2. And then the text here, it doesn't really make much sense. Let's just change it to departures. And then if I attempt to run this subroutine, I'll end up with 3 worksheets in the output, which is what you'd expect. And the code is running, I get no runtime errors. But if I look back at Excel, you'll see that in the departures table, it's completely empty. The problem with this is that I can't get the information from the departures table until it's visible. And to make it visible, I need to click on the departures button back in Chrome. So let's close that, sorry, beg pardon, let's get rid of these extra worksheets first of all. And then I'll get rid of this extra instance of Chrome that we've opened up. And then head back to the previous instance of Chrome. And I'm just going to right click on the departures button and choose to inspect it to find out how I could reference it. So I've found a span tag, but that's nested inside an A element, which has a unique ID, href departures. That's a promising sign. Any unique IDs are always a good thing. So we can see that if we click on the departures table, oh, in fact, let me just quickly select the tomorrow table for arrivals. When I click on the departures link, you'll see that it loads departures, but it also flicks back to today. So if I click on departures, that gives me today's departures. So I'm going to right click on this A element in the elements panel and choose copy and then copy selector. And then head back to the Visual Basic Editor. And then I'm going to say cd.FindElement by CSS, open some round brackets and some double quotes, paste in the selector I've just copied, close the double quotes and the round brackets, and apply the click method to that. I'm then just going to update this departures today. And then let's have a look. If I run the subroutine at this point, we'll end up with 3 new worksheets eventually. So we can see it clicking through the various elements. And if I switch back to Excel, I'll see that I do indeed get my departures today. Now in this case, we were lucky that the web page won the race between the VBA code and the departures table. So the departures table was updated and made visible before we attempted to get the information out of it in the VBA code. But that's not always going to be the case. It's difficult to demonstrate again. It is possible that if I run this subroutine again to do the exact same thing without making any changes whatsoever, that the next time I run it, I don't actually get the departures information because the table hadn't appeared before my code executed. As it turns out, it's worked again perfectly happily, but I can't always guarantee that. So it's always worthwhile thinking about whether an element will be visible or not, or whether it will be available to your code before you attempt to do something with it. Let me just tidy up this set of worksheets by selecting and then deleting them all. And then I want to make sure that the departures table body is visible before I attempt to copy the information out of it into an Excel worksheet. So with departures today selected, I can right click on any element within that table and choose to inspect it. And I'll see that below the head section, there's the T body section with a unique ID of departures. So I'm going to right click on that ID and choose copy and then copy selector. And then back in the VB editor, I want to make sure that that element is displayed before I attempt to copy anything from it. So to make that work, after I've clicked my departures button, I'm going to say flight tables 2 dot find element by CSS. So I'm going to look for a specific element inside that table, and then in some round brackets and double quotes, paste in the selector I've just copied, close the double quotes and the round brackets, and then a full stop, weight displayed, just as we saw earlier on with the Wikipedia example. So that gives me that reassurance that the table will definitely be visible before we attempt to copy out of that table into Excel. And just one last little test of that. Gets a bit boring waiting for it to run through all of its different clicks. But once again, we end up with a worksheet with today's departures, and we can have a quick visual check that that has the correct information displayed on it. Okay, so we have one more table to get, and that's tomorrow's departures. And we should be able to use the same basic technique we used for getting tomorrow's arrivals. We can find the button to click on, maybe wait for a second to give the table a chance to update, and then just copy the information from from the second instance of the table in the flight tables collection. So in fact, let's just do a quick copy paste of a bunch of that code. I'm going to do that now, so we can copy and paste that down to the bottom after departures for today. And then I'll update the flight table to the number 2, and then the word arrivals to the word departures. If we attempt to run that subroutine at this point, we'll see that it goes through its clicks. Gets to tomorrow, goes to departures and today, and then it doesn't appear to click on tomorrow's departures. There's a good reason for that. If I click into the background of my code, I'll see that I've got a runtime error. It's telling me that there's an element not visible error and an element not interactable. If I click debug, it shows me that it's where I'm trying to click on the to button, the tomorrow button. This is not immediately obvious what's gone wrong here. If I just stop running the subroutine and just head back to my original instance of Chrome, when we're on the arrivals page, the tomorrow button, as we saw and we've correctly identified, is nested in an li element with an ID of 2. When we're on the departures page, however, it isn't obvious that the web page has changed, but this is actually a different set of buttons. The tomorrow button here isn't the same one. This one is nested inside an li element whose ID is 2. So, as well as the departures table being invisible, the buttons which control the departures table are also now invisible, thus I can't click on them to interact with them. And of course, the one that I want to click on has a different ID. The change to make the code work is incredibly simple, but the cause of it is a little less obvious if you were just trying to observe what's happened on the web page as you click between buttons. So the solution, nice and simple. I can change 2 to 2, if that made any sense whatsoever. And then if I just clear up the worksheets that have been generated, and then run the subroutine one more time, we'll go through all the clicks. We get today's arrivals first of all. We get tomorrow's arrivals, today's departures and tomorrow's departures. And if we switch back to Excel, we should find tomorrow's departures, today's departures, tomorrow's arrivals and today's arrivals. So we have all 4 sheets that we wanted to get. So there we have it, the basic techniques for weighting implicitly and explicitly in Selenium. Of course, there are some more complicated techniques we can use, which we hinted at earlier on, but at this point I think I'll save those for a later video. Hope you found this one useful. Thanks for watching. See you next time.